World War II was not simply a war between nations, it was the total collapse of a global operating system. We often view the conflict as a series of isolated historical accidents or the result of a few uniquely evil men, but the data suggests a much darker, repeating pattern. By using history as a diagnostic scanner, we can identify how the world's largest economies once fell into a logic trap that made total war not just possible, but mathematically inevitable. Today, nearly all geopolitical events and international relations can be traced back to this single systemic crash, and the mechanisms that destroyed the 20th century did not disappear in 1945, they simply went dormant. The first component of this failure is the Humiliation Engine, a psychological pressure cooker built into the very foundation of the preceding peace. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles ended the First World War not with a resolution, but with a time bomb. By forcing a single nation to accept total responsibility through the War Guilt Clause, the victors created a poisonous foundation for the future. This wasn't just a matter of pride, it was a matter of math, as Germany was saddled with reparations totaling $33 billion, a sum that took nearly a century to fully repay. When a global system imposes conditions that a population perceives as an endless indignity, it creates fertile ground for a new breed of rabble-rousing politicians who promise to trade democratic liberty for national destiny. This psychological tension requires an economic catalyst to ignite. In 1929, the world was connected and seemingly prosperous, but the Great Depression acted as a systemic shock that exposed the fragility of the post-war order. As unemployment in Germany soared to 6 million, and a loaf of bread eventually cost 200 billion marks due to hyperinflation, the masses stopped believing in truth and started believing in victory at any cost. History reveals a recurring mechanism here. When the currency fails and the stomach is empty, the population will almost always choose the dictator who offers a solution over the democracy that offers a debate. As these internal pressures grew, a third mechanism emerged, the failure of institutional vigilance. The League of Nations was designed to be a new world order where disputes were settled by debate rather than fighting, yet it lacked the resolution to enforce its own rules. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and Italy invaded Abyssinia in 1935, the international community responded with condemnation but no significant action. These early aggressions were diagnostic tests for the system, and they proved that the old world order was a paper tiger. Dictators learned that the cost of aggression was low, while the cost of maintaining the status quo for the democracies was becoming uncomfortably high. This leads us to a critical, often unnamed mechanism, the sunk cost of peace. The Western powers were so profoundly traumatized by the horrific casualties of the First World War that their overwhelming desire for peace became the very thing that made a second war inevitable. This is the peace at any price trap. By pursuing a policy of appeasement, giving in to small demands like the annexation of the Sudetenland in exchange for a piece of paper, the leaders of the 1930s were not sating in expansionist power, they were validating its strategy. They were effectively hallucinating that a system designed for expansion could be satisfied by small concessions. Once the war began, the tactical asymmetry took over. The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was not just about tanks and aircraft, it was a system trying to bypass the physical and biological limits of the battlefield. While defending armies followed traditional human circadian rhythms, German forces were chemically enhanced with pervitin, a form of crystal meth, allowing soldiers to fight for days without sleep. This allowed the system to outpace its opponent's ability to even process the information of the attack. Simultaneously, the war became a technological race to bypass the limits of sight, with Britain developing the world's first integrated radar defense system to offset a massive numerical disadvantage in the air. Beneath the ideological rhetoric lay the resource trap. Both Germany and Japan felt they were trapped in a closed system where expansion was a survival reflex. The concept of Lebensraum, or living space, was driven by a perceived need for agricultural and resource self-sufficiency to survive a future blockade. Japan, lacking internal oil and iron, saw the colonies of the Pacific not as prizes, but as essential fuel for its rapidly expanding industrial engine. This reveals a structural pattern we still see today. When a nation perceives that its access to essential resources is controlled by a hostile or indifferent system, it will eventually attempt to break that system by force. As the conflict escalated into total mobilization, entire economies were converted into war machines, and the distinction between combatant and civilian was systematically erased. The intentional killing of civilians, from the firebombing of cities to the systematic horrors of the Holocaust and the eventual use of atomic weapons, was a desperate attempt to break the national morale that fueled the system. The war finally ended with a global reset, producing a statistical anomaly known as the Long Peace, a period of 80 years without direct conflict between the world's major economies. However, we must conclude with a final diagnostic warning. This peace is not a permanent change in human nature, but a high-maintenance system that requires constant vigilance. The recurring pattern of history is that when the cost of maintaining the status quo exceeds the perceived cost of war, the system resets. Today, we see modern parallels to the 1939 infection. The role of algorithmic radicalization has become the digital equivalent of the propaganda ministries of the 1930s, using economic pain to find new scapegoats in digital echo chambers. We see modern trade wars reflecting the same resource traps that once drove nations to desperation. If we stop diagnosing these patterns, we risk repeating the catastrophic reset that once claimed 60 million lives. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the fragile peace that has been growing around us.